Evelyn Cross had always considered herself a skeptic in the realm of the paranormal, despite her talents. Her psychic abilities were a gift she could not explain, a bridge between the living and the dead that she had learned to navigate out of necessity rather than choice. She approached every case with a mixture of caution and clinical detachment, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. Yet, when the letter arrived, something within her recoiled. It was a cold, gray morning when she found it slipped under her door. A plain envelope with her name scrawled in shaky, hurried handwriting. No address, no return name. She stared at it for a moment before picking it up, feeling a chill run down her spine. The paper was cold to the touch, as if it had been left in the frost-covered ground overnight. Evelyn opened the envelope carefully, half expecting a trick, but inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle at the edges. The words were written in the same frantic hand. "Miss Cross, Hollow Creek needs you. The coffin has opened again." She froze, the words sinking in like a knife. Hollow Creek. She had heard the stories. Everyone had. The cursed town with the open coffin that no one dared to speak of directly. It was a legend whispered among those who dealt with the supernatural, a tale so dark that even the most seasoned psychics and mediums avoided it. For years, she had pushed it to the back of her mind, dismissing it as another ghost story meant to scare those who dabbled in the unknown. But now, faced with this chilling invitation, she felt the weight of something real and malignant pressing in on her. The letter was unsigned, but it reeked of desperation, a plea from someone on the brink of madness. Evelyn reread the message several times, hoping to find more, some clue as to who had sent it or why, but there was nothing except that one ominous sentence. She stood there, her breath visible in the cold air of her apartment, her mind racing. By noon, Evelyn had made up her mind. She packed a small bag with her essentials, her journal, a camera, a handful of protective talismans, and the carved bone pendant she wore for every investigation. As she locked her door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was a mistake, that she was walking into something far darker than anything she had faced before. Yet, the pull was undeniable. The drive to Hollow Creek took longer than expected. The town was nestled deep in a valley, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to grow thicker and more oppressive the closer she got. The road wound through the trees like a serpent, and Evelyn felt a sense of isolation that grew with every mile. The sky was overcast, the clouds hanging low as if they were pressing down on the earth itself. When she finally arrived, Hollow Creek greeted her with an eerie silence. The town was small, almost claustrophobic, with narrow streets lined with houses that seemed to lean inwards as if conspiring against the outsider. There were no children playing, no sounds of life, just the occasional figure peeking through drawn curtains, their faces pale and withdrawn. Evelyn parked her car near the town square, where a dilapidated sign creaked in the wind, its paint faded to the point of illegibility. The cemetery lay on the outskirts of town, and as Evelyn approached, she felt an unnatural chill in the air. The iron gates, rusted and ancient, were partially open, as if inviting her in. Beyond them, tombstones jutted out of the ground like broken teeth, their inscriptions worn away by time. In the center of it all, she saw it, the open coffin. It lay upon a raised stone platform, its lid propped against the side as if it had been thrown open in haste. Evelyn stopped a few feet away, her heart pounding. The coffin was empty, but it radiated an aura of malevolence that made her skin prickle. The air around it was thick, almost tangible, and she could feel the presence of something watching her, waiting. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to step closer. Her breath misted in the cold air, and she could see her reflection in the polished wood of the coffin's interior. She crouched down, reaching out with her senses. Immediately, a rush of images flooded her mind. Dark figures moving in a circle, chanting words she couldn't understand. A flash of fire and screams that echoed into the night. She stumbled back, gasping, her head spinning. The visions were disjointed, fragments of a past steeped in blood and fear. She pressed her hand to her temple, trying to make sense of what she had seen. The coffin was not just a resting place, it was a focal point for something dark and ancient. As Evelyn stood, a figure emerged from the shadows of the cemetery, a man, old and gaunt, with eyes that seemed too large for his hollowed face. He approached slowly, his gaze fixed on the coffin. "You felt it, didn't you?" he said, his voice a dry rasp. Evelyn nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "Who are you?" "The caretaker," he replied, his lips barely moving. "I've been watching this place for years. The coffin, it's never stayed closed. Not since the day they buried him." "Buried who?" Evelyn asked, though she felt she already knew the answer. "The one they call Marcus Thorne," the caretaker whispered, his voice trembling. "He's not at rest. He never was." Evelyn's mouth went dry. She had heard the name before, mentioned in hushed tones by those who dared to speak of Hollow Creek. Thorne was said to be the leader of the cult that had once plagued this town, a man who had sought power through forbidden rituals. But those were just stories, legends meant to frighten. "Why now?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "Why has the coffin opened again?" The caretaker shook his head, his eyes darting around as if afraid they were being watched. "Something stirs in the dark. It's as if he's calling for someone. Or something." Evelyn glanced back at the coffin, her resolve hardening. This was more than just a haunting. This was a call for justice, a story that needed to be uncovered piece by terrifying piece. She turned back to the caretaker, but he had already started to retreat into the shadows, his figure dissolving into the fog that had begun to roll in. She was alone again, standing before the open coffin, the air around her growing colder. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a low murmur that sounded almost like a voice, beckoning her to look deeper, to seek the truth that lay buried beneath fear and silence. Evelyn shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization that this was only the beginning. The secrets of Hollow Creek were calling to her, and she knew that the path she was about to tread would take her to the very edge of her sanity. With one last look at the coffin, Evelyn turned and walked back toward the town, the whispers following her every step. Evelyn stood in the Hollow Creek library, the stale scent of old paper and dust hanging heavy in the air. It was the kind of place that had been forgotten by time, much like the town itself. Shelves crammed with books and yellowed documents lined the walls, their contents barely touched in decades. Evelyn knew the answers lay here, buried among the history of Hollow Creek. Somewhere within these crumbling pages was the story of the open coffin and the man called Marcus Thorne. She started with the town records, scanning through faded photographs and brittle newspaper clippings. The caretaker's words echoed in her mind. "He's not at rest. He never was." The stories of Thorne and his cult were sketchy at best, more rumor than fact, but they all pointed to a single event, the failed ritual that had cursed the town. Her eyes settled on a photograph from the late 1800s, showing the townspeople gathered in front of the cemetery gates. In the center stood a man with a commanding presence, his eyes dark and piercing even through the grainy image. Marcus Thorne. Beside him was a coffin, the coffin surrounded by symbols etched into the earth. Behind him, a group of robed figures stood in a circle, their faces hidden beneath hoods. Evelyn's pulse quickened. The picture was a snapshot of the very moment Hollow Creek's nightmare began. According to the scant reports, Thorne had led a group of followers known as the Watchers. They believed in an ancient entity that could grant them power over life and death, an entity they referred to simply as the Watcher. The ritual was meant to bridge the gap between the living and the beyond, using the coffin as a conduit. But something had gone wrong. terribly wrong. As Evelyn read through the accounts, a pattern began to emerge. The townspeople, desperate and afraid, had banded together to stop Thorn's ritual. They had stormed the cemetery, interrupting the rite in a chaotic clash that ended with Thorn's death. But the stories diverged on one key detail. What exactly happened to Thorn? Some claimed he had been buried alive, bound to the coffin he had opened to the other side. Others whispered that his spirit had been trapped, doomed to linger at the threshold of life and death, forever guarding the secret he had sought to unlock. A shiver ran down Evelyn's spine as she pieced together the fragments of history. The coffin had remained open ever since that night, a grim reminder of the town's dark past. But why? Why had it never been closed? Why did the curse persist? She needed more. There was something missing, something that tied Thorn, the coffin, and the Watcher together. Evelyn's search led her to an old journal, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the library. The leather cover was cracked and worn, its pages brittle with age. Inside, the handwriting was barely legible, scrawled in haste as if the author had been in a panic. The journal belonged to one of the townspeople who had been present on the night of the ritual. As she read, Evelyn felt as though she were being drawn into that night, the words pulling her into the horror that had unfolded. They came in the night. The journal began. Thorn and his followers, their faces hidden, their voices chanting in a language none of us knew. We watched from the shadows, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The coffin lay open, waiting. I cannot say what they summoned, but the air grew heavy, thick with something that pressed against my mind, whispering to me, urging me to come closer. Evelyn's eyes darted over the lines, her breath hitching as she read the description of the ritual's climax. Thorn stood at the coffin's edge, his hands raised to the sky. The others followed, their voices rising to a fever pitch. And then, it happened. A darkness spilled from the coffin, not a shadow, but something alive, writhing and twisting in the air. It was as if the night itself had been torn open. I heard screams, ours, theirs, the cries of something else. The air cracked with a sound like the tearing of flesh. Thorn. He did not falter. He called to it, beckoning it forth. Evelyn's heart raced. She could almost hear the chanting, the screams. The journal described the moment the townspeople rushed forward, driven by sheer terror and the instinct to survive. We fought them, the journal continued, but it was too late. The coffin, it was a doorway. I saw it, a glimpse into the beyond, into something that should not exist. Thorn fell, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with triumph. And then it was over. The coffin remained open, its secret sealed within. We buried Thorn beside it, but we knew it would not be the end. Evelyn closed the journal, her hands trembling. The coffin was not just a symbol of death. It was a vessel, a prison for something far more sinister. The townspeople had succeeded in stopping Thorn, but in doing so, they had left the doorway ajar, trapping whatever darkness they had summoned between worlds. The spirits she had seen in her visions were echoes of that night, restless fragments of the souls who had been caught in the crossfire between life and the void. As she sat in the dimly lit library, a cold draft swept through the room, rattling the windows. Evelyn looked up, her senses on high alert. She was not alone. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, and for a moment she thought she saw the silhouette of a man watching her from the far end of the room. She blinked and he was gone, leaving only the lingering sense of being observed. Evelyn knew she was getting closer to the truth, but with every answer, more questions arose. Who or what was the Watcher? And why had Thorn been so eager to summon it? She had a feeling that the answers lay not just in the past, but in the present, in the actions of those who still walked among the living in Hollow Creek, Her investigation led her next to the outskirts of town, to the abandoned manor that once belonged to Marcus Thorne. It stood at the edge of the forest, its windows dark and empty, its walls covered in vines that twisted like gnarled fingers. The townspeople avoided it, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of Thorne's followers. Evelyn pushed open the iron gate, its hinges squealing in protest, and walked the overgrown path to the front door. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of decay and disuse. Dust motes floated in the weak sunlight that filtered through the cracked windows. The floor creaked under her weight as she moved cautiously through the halls. The manor felt alive, as if it were watching her with every step she took. She made her way to the cellar, the place where, according to legend, Thorne had conducted his rituals in secret. The cellar door was locked, but Evelyn found a rusty key hidden behind a loose stone in the wall. With a heavy click, the door swung open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. She hesitated, gripping the flashlight in her hand, then descended, each step taking her further into the cold, damp air below. At the bottom, she found a chamber lined with symbols carved into the stone walls, symbols that matched those she had seen in her visions and the photograph. In the center of the chamber was an altar, and upon it, a series of artifacts, candles, bones, and a worn leather book. She opened the book, her breath catching as she recognized the symbols. It was Thorne's journal, a record of his work with the Watchers. The pages were filled with incantations and diagrams, detailed instructions for the ritual that had gone wrong. As she flipped through the pages, a passage caught her eye. The Watcher awaits, bound in the void between worlds. The coffin is the key, the vessel through which it may pass. The ritual must be completed, or the town shall remain cursed, its people trapped in the shadow of death. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The ritual had not been a simple act of summoning. It was a binding, an attempt to trap the entity known as the Watcher. But they had failed. Thorne had not been the villain in the way the townspeople had believed. He had been attempting to contain something far worse. Now, over a century later, the echoes of his failure reverberated through Hollow Creek, the coffin standing as a reminder of the incomplete battle between the living and the void. A sound echoed through the chamber, a faint whisper that sent shivers down Evelyn's spine. She turned, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. Yet the whisper persisted, a voice that seemed to emanate from the very walls around her. "It is not over," the voice murmured, the words slithering into her mind like tendrils of smoke. "It never was." Evelyn's grip tightened on the flashlight. She knew now that she was up against something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. The Watcher was stirring, its influence growing as the boundary between worlds weakened. The coffin was a gateway, and Hollow Creek was teetering on the edge of its abyss. With newfound determination, Evelyn turned and made her way back up the stairs. She had to find a way to close the coffin once and for all. But to do that, she needed to understand the ritual, to finish what Thorne had started. And that meant facing the darkness that lay at the heart of Hollow Creek, the darkness that had claimed so many lives before her. As she emerged into the daylight, Evelyn felt the eyes of the town upon her. The spirits of the past, the shadows of the present, all watching, waiting. The echoes of the past were growing louder, and she knew that soon they would demand to be heard. The days that followed were filled with an oppressive tension, the atmosphere in Hollow Creek growing darker with each passing hour. It was as if the town itself held its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. Evelyn knew the ritual's resurgence was imminent. The signs were all around her. Nightmares plagued her sleep, visions of shadowy figures chanting in tongues, their eyes empty and void of humanity. Every morning she awoke drenched in cold sweat, her heart pounding with the terror that clung to her even in the daylight. The townspeople had become more withdrawn, their faces etched with fear and suspicion. Doors were bolted shut by dusk, and no one spoke of the coffin or the recent events. Evelyn sensed that they knew more than they let on, that some had ties to the ancient cult that had once worshipped the Watcher. Her suspicions were confirmed one evening when she was approached by a frail, elderly woman outside the general store. "They're going to try again," the woman whispered, her eyes darting nervously around as if she feared being overheard. "The ritual, they think it will save us." Evelyn's heart sank. "Who?" she asked, leaning in, her voice urgent. "Who is trying to complete the ritual?" The woman hesitated, glancing at the ground as if the words were too heavy to utter. "The elders, those who are left, they believe it's the only way to end the curse. They've been waiting, preparing." Evelyn felt a surge of anger and fear. Preparing? They're fools if they think they can control it. The ritual failed for a reason. It's not something that can be contained. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "They think you can help them, that you're the key, your abilities." Evelyn stepped back, the full weight of the revelation crashing down on her. This was why she had been called to Hollow Creek. Not just to investigate, but to be a part of the ritual, to serve as the conduit they needed to finish what Marcus Thorne had started. The shadowy figure she had seen, the one who had been watching her, it all made sense now. She was not merely an observer, she was the final piece in their dark puzzle. That night, Evelyn stood in front of the open coffin, the moon a silver sliver in the overcast sky. The cemetery was deathly silent, the air around her unnaturally still. She could feel the presence of the coffin, its power thrumming like a heartbeat in the earth beneath her feet. The spirits were restless, their voices a cacophony at the edges of her consciousness. She closed her eyes, reaching out with her mind, seeking answers. The visions came in a rush, more vivid and intense than ever before. She was back in the past, standing among Thorne and his followers as they chanted around the coffin. The air was electric, charged with the energy of the ritual. The coffin was the focal point, a bridge between worlds, and the Watcher was stirring, its presence a dark and terrible force that pressed against her very soul. But this time Evelyn saw something she had not seen before. Among the followers, standing slightly apart, was a figure cloaked in shadow. The Elder, the one who had orchestrated everything, both then and now. She couldn't see his face, but she felt his gaze upon her, cold and calculating. He had known even then that the ritual would fail, that it was only the beginning of a larger plan, a plan that would span generations. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her breath ragged. The Elder was here, in Hollow Creek, and he was preparing to complete the ritual. But what was his true purpose? To end the curse or to unleash the Watcher upon the world? The answer came to her in a chilling realization. It was both. The Elder believed that by releasing the Watcher, he could control it, harness its power to free the town from its curse and bend it to his will. The ritual's failure had been a delay, not a defeat. And now, with Evelyn as the psychic conduit, he intended to succeed where Thorne had failed. The following day, Evelyn began her search for the Elder. She knew he would be hiding in plain sight, blending in with the townspeople just as he had done in the past. The clues led her to the outskirts of town, to an old church that had been abandoned long ago. Its doors were boarded up, its windows broken, yet it emanated a sense of foreboding that made her skin crawl. She pried open a side door and stepped inside. The interior was dark, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust swirled in the dim light that filtered through the cracked stained glass windows. In the center of the nave, Evelyn saw it, a circle of candles arranged around a wooden effigy. Symbols were etched into the floorboards, the same symbols she had seen in the cellar of Thorne's manor and in her visions. And then she heard it, a voice, low and resonant, chanting words that sent a shiver down her spine. She turned and saw him, the Elder, standing at the altar, his eyes closed, his hands raised in supplication to an unseen force. "Stop!" Evelyn shouted, her voice echoing in the hollow space. The elder's eyes snapped open and he turned to face her. His face was gaunt, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "You're too late, Miss Cross," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "The ritual is already in motion. The coffin is open and the watcher will rise." Evelyn stepped forward, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. You think you can control it, but you can't. It will consume you." The elder smiled, a twisted expression of pity and triumph. "You see only half of the truth. The Watcher is not to be feared, but embraced. It is the key to freeing us from this endless cycle of death. With it, we will transcend." Evelyn shook her head, her voice rising. "It's not transcendence. It's annihilation. You're dooming everyone." He raised his hands, and the candles flared with an otherworldly light. "It is too late to stop now. The ritual demands completion, and you, Miss Cross, are the catalyst." The ground beneath Evelyn trembled, the very air vibrating with a deep, thrumming power. She could feel the pull of the coffin, its dark energy reaching out, seeking her. The elder began to chant once more, his voice merging with the rising wind that howled through the broken windows. Evelyn stumbled, fighting against the force that dragged her toward the center of the circle. She closed her eyes, drawing on every ounce of her psychic strength. This was what the elder wanted, to use her as a vessel, a bridge to open the gateway fully. But she would not be his pawn. She reached out with her mind, past the elder, past the ritual, into the void where the Watcher lurked. It was a cold, consuming darkness, a presence that exuded hunger and malice. "You seek to use me," Evelyn thought, directing her will toward the Watcher. "But I am not yours to command." The void shifted, a whisper like 1,000 voices sighing in unison. The Watcher acknowledged her, its awareness pressing against hers, testing, probing. "Evelyn!" a voice called from behind her. She turned, the spell of the void breaking momentarily. It was the townspeople, the caretaker among them, their faces pale and strained. They had gathered at the entrance of the church, drawn by the disturbance, their fear replaced by a grim determination. "You don't have to do this," the caretaker pleaded, his voice hoarse. "There must be another way." Evelyn glanced back at the elder, his face twisted in fury. "Fools!" he spat. "You cannot stop what has already begun." In that moment, Evelyn understood. The ritual was not just a summoning, it was a battle of wills, a struggle for dominance over the power that the coffin held, and she had one chance to turn the tide. With a scream, she surged forward, throwing herself into the circle, breaking the elder's concentration. He staggered, the flames flickering wildly as the ground shook with violent force. Evelyn reached out, her hands brushing the effigy at the circle's center, feeling the surge of power flow through her. The air split with a deafening crack, and the void opened, a gaping maw of darkness that yawned beneath the church floor. The Watcher's presence flooded the room, a cold and merciless force that threatened to pull everything into its abyss. Evelyn closed her eyes, focusing all her energy on the coffin's power. She felt the spirits of the past, the souls of those who had died that night long ago. They were there with her, their voices joining hers in a chorus of defiance against the elder's madness. "No!" the elder screamed, his voice drowned by the roar of the void. He lunged at Evelyn, but she stood firm, her eyes glowing with an ethereal light. She was not alone. The spirits rallied to her side, their forms materializing in the flickering shadows. Evelyn reached out, not to the Watcher, but to the coffin itself. She could feel its essence, the ancient wood carved with symbols of power and protection. She called upon it, summoning its strength not as a gateway, but as a seal. The void howled in rage, the darkness writhing and thrashing. Evelyn felt herself being torn apart, the force of the Watcher's will pressing against her, but she held on, her voice rising above the chaos. "Close," she commanded, her mind pushing against the void. "Close the gate." The coffin responded, its power surging through her, a force of light against the encroaching darkness. The void began to shrink, the howling diminishing into a low, mournful wail. The elder cried out, his form dissolving into the shadows as the ritual collapsed, his ambition consumed by the very darkness he sought to control. With a final, earth-shattering crack, the void snapped shut, the church plunging into silence. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. The candles had blown out, the symbols on the floor scorched and blackened. The townspeople rushed forward, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and horror. The caretaker knelt beside her, his eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. "It's over," he whispered. Evelyn shook her head weakly. "No," she murmured, her voice barely a breath. "Not over. Contained. For now." She knew the Watcher was not defeated, merely sealed away once more, its hunger waiting for another chance. The ritual had failed, but the coffin remained open, a sentinel at the boundary between worlds. As she was helped to her feet, Evelyn looked toward the cemetery, where the open coffin lay under the shrouded moon. It was a victory, but a temporary one. The ritual had been thwarted, but the question loomed. How long before the Watcher would stir again? She turned to the caretaker, her eyes reflecting the resolve within her. "We need to find a way to close it," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that weighed on her. "Permanently." The caretaker nodded, his face grim. "We will," he promised. "Together." Evelyn gazed into the night, the whispers of the spirits fading into the silence. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Hollow Creek still held its secrets, and the Watcher was not done with them yet. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint whispers of the dead. The cemetery lay cloaked in the silvery veil of moonlight, casting long shadows over the tombstones. The open coffin sat in its place, a silent guardian at the heart of Hollow Creek. It was the eye of the storm, the stillness before the final reckoning. Evelyn stood before it, the cold seeping through her bones as she steeled herself for what she knew had to be done. For days, she and the caretaker had scoured every corner of the town, every forgotten record and whispered legend, seeking a way to close the coffin for good. They had found clues in the remnants of Thorne's journal, scattered passages hinting at a binding spell, a final act that could seal the Watcher away permanently. But it came with a price, a sacrifice that Evelyn had known, deep down, would fall to her. She looked down at the carved symbols on the coffin's lid, her fingers tracing the intricate lines. The wood was cold, pulsing with an unnatural energy that thrummed beneath her touch. The Watcher was waiting, its presence just beyond the veil, hungry and aware. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing against her chest. She knew what needed to be done, and she was ready to face it. The caretaker stood beside her, his face drawn and pale. He had aged in the past few days, the strain of the ritual's resurgence taking its toll on him. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough and filled with sorrow. "There has to be another way." Evelyn shook her head, her gaze fixed on the coffin. "There isn't. The Watcher will never stop until it has what it wants. We can't keep sealing it away, hoping it won't break through. This has to end tonight." She turned to face the caretaker, the man who had guarded the town's secret for so long. In his eyes, she saw the anguish of generations, the fear and hope of all who had come before her. "You've done all you could," she said gently. "Now it's my turn." He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. He knew, just as she did, that this was the only way. His shoulders sagged in defeat, and he nodded slowly. Then I'll be here with you until the end." Evelyn offered him a faint smile, a flicker of warmth in the cold night. She then turned back to the coffin, her heart pounding in her chest. She knelt beside it, placing her hands on the edge, feeling the pull of the void within. The ritual had begun, but this time it was her doing. She closed her eyes, drawing on her psychic abilities, reaching into the darkness that lurked just beyond the veil. The world around her faded, the cemetery dissolving into shadows. She was in the void, a place of endless darkness where time and space had no meaning. Before her loomed the Watcher, a formless presence that exuded malice and ancient hunger. It pulsed with a life of its own, its essence swirling around her like a storm. Evelyn felt its gaze upon her, a cold, invasive force that sought to consume her. "You seek to seal me away," it whispered, its voice a chorus of echoes. "You cannot." Evelyn forced herself to stand tall, her voice steady despite the terror that clawed at her. "I can, and I will." The Watcher surged forward, its darkness wrapping around her, suffocating and relentless. Evelyn gasped as she felt it pressing against her mind, probing her memories, her fears. It showed her images of Hollow Creek, of the lives it had touched and twisted, Thorn, the townspeople, even the spirits that lingered on the fringes of the void. All had been pawns in its endless game, pieces on a board that it had manipulated for centuries. But then Evelyn saw something else. She saw Marcus Thorn, not as a cult leader, but as a man desperate to save his town. She saw him standing before the coffin, his face etched with determination and sorrow, performing the ritual that was meant to bind the Watcher, not release it. He had failed, but not for lack of trying. The Watcher had used his fear, twisted his intentions, turning his act of sacrifice into a curse that haunted Hollow Creek. Evelyn's heart ached with the truth. Thorn had not been the monster. He had been the guardian, the one who had given everything to protect the town. And now it was her turn to take up that mantle. The Watcher's darkness pressed harder, its power threatening to crush her. But Evelyn fought back, drawing on the strength of those who had come before her, on the spirits that lingered in the shadows. She reached deep within herself, to the core of her psychic power, the force that connected her to the world beyond. She felt the presence of the spirits around her, their hands on her shoulders, their voices whispering in her ear. They were with her, guiding her, lending her their strength. She raised her hands, the symbols from Thorn's journal glowing in the air around her, lines of light that wove into a pattern, a seal that would bind the Watcher for all time. The void howled in fury, the darkness churning and writhing as it fought against the binding. Evelyn's body shook with the effort, her mind straining against the force that battered her from all sides. The Watcher pushed against the seal, its voice rising to a scream that tore through her soul. "You cannot contain me." Evelyn gritted her teeth, her voice rising above the cacophony. "I can, and I will." With a final surge of power, she thrust her hands forward, the seal blazing with an intensity that blinded her. The Watcher roared, its form disintegrating into wisps of shadow as the seal closed around it, drawing it back into the coffin's depths. The void collapsed inward, the darkness spiraling into the coffin, which slammed shut with a deafening boom. Evelyn fell to her knees, gasping for breath, the ground beneath her solid and real once more. She was back in the cemetery, the moonlight soft and cold against her skin. The coffin lay before her, its lid sealed tight, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly before fading into stillness. The caretaker rushed to her side, his eyes wide with shock and awe. "You did it," he breathed, his voice trembling. "You sealed it away." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes hollow with the knowledge of what she had done. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not just sealed. I became the seal." He stared at her in confusion, the realization dawning on him slowly. What do you mean? She took his hand, her grip weak. The only way to bind the Watcher was to become its guardian. Just like Thorn, I'm part of the coffin now, part of the seal that keeps it contained. Her gaze drifted to the coffin, her heart heavy with the weight of her sacrifice. I'm the gatekeeper. Tears welled in the caretaker's eyes as he grasped the magnitude of what she had done. But what happens to you? Evelyn managed a faint smile, though it was filled with sadness. I'll be here, in the shadows, watching, guarding. The curse is broken, but the price is me. The caretaker bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Evelyn reached out, touching his cheek, her hand cold as the grave. Remember this, she said softly. The darkness is always there, but it can be fought. It can be contained, as long as someone is willing to stand against it. With that, she stood, her form beginning to blur at the edges, her presence fading into the night. The caretaker watched, tears streaming down his face as Evelyn Cross, the psychic who had saved Hollow Creek, became one with the shadows, her spirit merging with the power that bound the Watcher. The cemetery fell silent, the air still and calm. The coffin lay undisturbed, its surface unmarred, the symbols that once glowed now hidden beneath its dark wood. The caretaker looked at it, his heart aching with both loss and gratitude. Hollow Creek was free, but the price had been dear. He turned and walked away, the weight of his duty heavier than ever. He would watch over the coffin as Evelyn had watched over the town. And though she was gone, her spirit lingered, a guardian in the shadows, the whisper of the wind through the trees. As he passed through the cemetery gates, he paused and looked back one last time. The moon cast its light over the graves, over the place where the battle had been fought and won. And in that light, he thought he saw a figure standing beside the coffin, her eyes glowing softly in the darkness. Evelyn, the guardian of secrets, forever watching, forever vigilant. He bowed his head and whispered into the night, "Thank you." The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying a faint whisper, a voice that was at once a part of the shadows, and yet transcendent. The battle is over, but the watch never ends. And with that, Hollow Creek settled into a peace it had not known for over a century, watched over by the spirit of a woman who had given everything to save it. But somewhere in the silence there remained the faintest echo, a reminder that the Watcher was never truly gone, only contained, held in check by the strength of a guardian willing to stand between the light and the dark. The coffin lay closed, its secret safe for now, but the legend of the open coffin would live on, a story to remind those who came after that even in the darkest of places, there is always a light willing to stand against the shadows. And so Evelyn Cross watched, from her place beyond the veil, forever guarding the secret in the open coffin.